Hello everyone, and welcome to this tutorial on my mineral studies. Um, just something that I just want to mention before I sort of really get into this is that straight off the bat, the software that I use is Houdini, and the render engine that I'm using is Arnold. You do not need that software though in order to replicate this. Those are just the tools that I use and that I'm comfortable with. But I would very much like to think that regardless of whatever it is that you're comfortable with, this is something that with enough time and with enough attention to detail can very easily be replicated regardless of the combination. So with regards to good strategies, before I'll sit down and create anything, I'll try and be very sort of clear with regards to what it is that I want to achieve and what it is that I'm trying to avoid. So for something like this, or any material study or any project, I find that this is particularly useful in that it can help you to really save a lot of time in that you are not spending hours potentially going down a particular avenue that is not going to yield the kind of results that you're really after. So in terms of what it is that I would actually want from this, the first thing that is of high priority for me is something that is interesting. And this interesting factor, for me, it leads to the idea of appeal. And appeal is extremely important because that is ultimately what helps to decide whether or not somebody actually likes what it is that they're seeing. Although these material studies are I would say they're somewhat realistic. To try and sort of prove them as being hyper realistic or whatever the case is, I think that's really something that is left up to the viewer. That's not something that can be definitively proven, I think, across a general audience, and everyone's going to have their own perceptions of what they believe the realism to actually be. Instead, what I think you should maybe rather focus on is the context in which it actually appears, and that actually ultimately, I think, goes a lot further in either helping to accomplish that realism that you're after, or at least just giving you a general idea with regards to the stylistic direction in which you would like to go. So something I get asked about quite a lot actually is the lighting that I use for the material studies, at least. So it's basically the same scene, and I think it's a fairly simple construction that I'm using. The first thing that I use is obviously a sweep or an infinity curve. The shader that is applied to this, it's a very simple off-white shader that has a specular roughness, or it's set to 1, I should rather say, just so that there's no glossiness. I prefer to not have any glossiness in these scenes. So for all those that might be using a different render engine other than Arnold, specular roughness is basically the control that either makes something glossy or makes something rough in its appearance. Okay, so with whatever render engine that you're using, you basically want to be able to find whatever that might be called, whether it be glossiness or roughness, whatever the case is, and you just want to make sure, if you do want to try and mimic what I have, that the roughness is set to 1, so that it's basically not glossy. It's the reflections that I'm trying to avoid. I personally prefer to not have them. It's obviously a personal decision, and you are welcome to tweak that however you see fit. With regards to the lighting itself, there's only 4 lights that I use. The first light, and what I would call my key light as well, is a light that comes down from the top. This is an area light. I would say that the major look of everything being rendered is actually driven by this light. Why do I prefer to use the top light? Well, mainly just for, I would say, just for visual aesthetics and the way that it looks. I find that it helps very much in terms of the light play, and it also helps to show off a lot of the detail quite nicely as well. So, I try not to sort of overthink it too much. And to be honest with you, I haven't really spent too much time sort of like, analyzing the ins and outs of the light setup. Like I said, it's just a general formula that I use. And to be honest with you, it's not something I want to spend too much time on, particularly with these material studies. I would much rather spend more time on creating the actual material itself. So that's just the top light. I then have a light directly to the left, as well as another one directly to the right. These are just sort of fill lights. Once again, also area lights that I put in. I would say that one thing that you maybe would just want to keep in mind is that the size of your light is always going to determine the softness of the shadows that you are getting. So here I would say it would just be prudent of you just to play around with your positioning of your lights to really achieve the effect that you're after. And obviously you also want to pay attention to things such as intensity. You want to try and avoid something that looks overexposed, and particularly if you're not going to be using a tone mapping workflow. And for all of those who are familiar with tone mapping, you'll understand where I'm going with that. For those of you who are not, I'm not going to be covering this in this tutorial because it's not necessary and it's not being used. But if you are interested, you're welcome to give me a shout, get in contact with me, and I can maybe see what I can do just to help explain that further. The last light that I do use is an environment light, and this environment light has an HDRI that's been mapped into it. This HDRI I can't supply. It's not a free map that I use, and it has been purchased. But with sites such as HDRI Haven, there is so much of this that is now available that I don't even think it's even necessary to want to explore those routes or those avenues. For something such as this, I would much rather recommend that you go onto the site, go and just find an appropriate studio-like image that has been taken from HDRI Haven, and then just maybe use that instead. This light, the intensity is fairly low on this light, and that's just because of the fact that I prefer to not have this scene overall driven by that overall lighting kind of look to it, where it just feels as though everything's now just suddenly been flooded by that light. Instead, what I like to use it for is just some low-level reflections, and just helping just to fill out those areas that would otherwise maybe just get a little bit too dark. So again, just a personal preference and something that I find works really well for me, at least. But you might want to tweak it on your side, and if that is the case, then I would definitely encourage you to do so. Alright, so getting down to the actual making of the asset itself. I mean, to be fair, it is a crystal, so it's a fairly simple shape to try and create. And what I would definitely recommend is for anybody who has access to ZBrush, which I think it's probably safe to say is going to be most artists at this point. I would definitely recommend maybe just jumping into ZBrush and just putting together a basic shape. I don't think that you should spend too much time overthinking that as well. In terms of this, as you can see, I started off from a very basic shape itself, with the more important work occurring when it came time to actually start adding in the weather details and actually sculpting into the geometry itself. So what I mean by that is breaking that silhouette, that very clean silhouette that I particularly wanted for this example. But this also leads us to a very important, I would say, juncture in this process, in which, like I was saying in the beginning, know what it is that you're going after from the get-go, because this process that I'm using, whereby I am scuffing the details and I am creating a more weathered look to the gemstone itself, this might not be something that you actually want, and you might prefer something that actually looks cleaner, depending on for whatever your personal requirement is, or maybe it's for a job or whatever the case is. But this is where knowing what you want your end result to be is really critical at this stage. So this is just adding the external details, the surface details to it, which would be, like I said, just some general scratches, really kind of just like, carving into the edges a bit and just giving it a sense of interest and a sense of story. From here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take it into Houdini, and then I'm going to begin the fracturing process, which is going to really help to add all those details that we see on the inside of the material. One last thing that I would recommend that you do after sculpting, and I think that this is a good workflow to use, regardless of whatever a primary software package you're going to be using to do your shading and your lighting in, and that would be to decimate your sculpt. For those of you who might not know, which I don't think are going to be too many of you, decimation inside of ZBrush is just a really phenomenal system in which ZBrush takes a look at the mesh and puts out a drastically reduced triangulated mesh that is still able to hold on to all the necessary detail through some very, very clever algorithms. This is great because the geometry that we can then export is a lot lighter, meaning that we don't have to worry about things such as displacement mapping, which is not really something, again, that I want to be too concerned with at this point. I would much rather just work with a decimated mesh and just make the process go just a little bit quicker. Okay, so now we've got the asset already and sculpted. We're now going to be taking it into Houdini, in my case, into Houdini, and essentially now prepping it for the actual rendering. So there's one or two things that we want to make sure of before we even start with any kind of shading, and that's making sure that we've set up Arnold in such a way that it can actually render this kind of material correctly. So I can only assume that a similar process might be needed for other renderers. So if that's the case, then maybe just use this time just to make sure that your renderer is set up correctly so that there's no confusion with regards to maybe certain kind of translucencies not displaying the way that it should. Okay, so basically one of the first things I want to make sure that I do is that for Arnold, on the geometry node itself, I want to make sure to tell Arnold to actually see the surface as being transparent. And one of the ways that we can do that is to turn off the opaque setting, and then that way Arnold knows that it is actually a translucent material that it needs to try and render. Otherwise, with it turned on, what's going to happen is that you might still, for the most part, actually see a very similar result. But in particular, you'll notice that when it comes to things such as the shadows on the ground, you're not going to get the same kind of light spill, or rather, I should say, the color spill that you would get from having the opaque flag turned off. The other thing is in the actual render node itself. One of the things that I want to do is I just want to come over to the Arnold, the ROP node, and under the ray depth, I want to make sure that I have enough transmissive rays that is being shot out into the scene. And I would say that under the sampling, this is not really going to be something that's going to be too much of a concern for me at this point. Because it's still very, very early days, and you'd want to keep these settings as low as possible so that you're not waiting and burning valuable time in having your renders complete. So you want to try and keep them nice and low. Like I said, the biggest one is mainly just the ray depth and ensuring that you have enough transmissive rays that are being shot out so that you can get an accurate feedback with regards to your material. So I feel like one of the biggest challenges in creating material like this is actually understanding how the transmissive properties of the shader works. So I've just done an initial render just with a default Arnold standard material applied. This is just to make sure that the lighting is holding up from the setup that we've previously created, just to make sure that everything is going according to plan. From here though, I'm going to be making a more specific material for the gemstone, one that actually has the transmission values in the process of being set up. So what I've done here is I've turned off my base contribution, mainly because of the fact that this is a transmissive material, so it doesn't really have any kind of a diffuse or base, in this case, component to it. The specular, I'm just using a specular value of 0.5 with a white color and the roughness of 0.2. I would prefer that this gemstone just remains a little bit more on the glossy side. with an IOR of 1.46. These might not be final values. These would be things that I would then go over again at the end just to make sure that everything is working correctly. But then we get down to the transmission values, and this is sort of really obviously where it all kind of works. So my transmission value is set to 1 with a color of white, and my depth is set to 1, and I'm not really going to bother with any of the other settings for now. I'm just going to focus on just those 3 inside of the transmission tab. So with the transmission of 1, we're basically saying that this material is obviously purely transmissive, which is what it needs to be. But the color and the depth, I think that is where the relationship just needs to be understood, because both of these properties are actually acting as almost like scale attributes, and they are both deciding how far into the volume, in this case, and volume being the actual geometry, but how far in those light rays travel before they actually start returning the transmission color that has already been defined. Now, obviously, if that is the transmission color is white, then you might not see that much of a difference, particularly as you play with the depth value. But where it really sort of comes into play is if you start adding color. So I know for a fact that one of the colors that I'm going to be using is going to be a little bit darker, and I want to be sort of mixing it up with a lighter color. And mixing those 2 colors together, they're going to give a very interesting contrast between those kind of scale values that's been inherited through the color attribute itself. Obviously, because the darker color is going to be meaning that the light rays are not going to be traveling very deep into the surface at all before it returns that color, whereas the lighter mix of the color, that's going to be doing the opposite, which means that we're going to get this a mixture of the material both feeling as though there are areas in which it is thinner, as well as areas where it just feels a little bit more dense, and that's something that I really want to leverage, because I think that adds a very interesting complexity to it, where it does just require just a little bit of playing around is then when it comes time to start adjusting the depth value itself. Now, I can't remember by default whether or not the depth is set to 0 or 1. I just started off with it set to 1. But I found that with the depth being set to 1, the problem with it was that the gemstone was just looking very, very light. It didn't look as though it had much volume inside of it at all, which I didn't really like. So the depth that I adjusted it to was actually 0.07. But it really is just the relationship between those that is going to ultimately create the final look, I would say for the most part actually, for this. And this is actually really where everything lies in terms of actually creating the look for the material. It doesn't really get too complicated, past this point. The only other thing that you can end up doing with the shader is that you can break up the specular roughness a little bit, just to have patches where it's a little bit glossier versus other areas where it's a little bit lighter, or sorry, not lighter, but rather a little bit rougher. And that's always nice, because you can draw a lot of detail out of any surface when you start putting a little bit of effort into, I would say, defining your specular roughness in more detail. So that's something that you can definitely do, as well as adding some light scratches or a bump map and that sort of thing. But with regards to the actual color and the vibrancy of the color, it's going to be spending a lot of time on this transmission tab, and particularly between the color and the depth. And please also just note that the colors that I'm using and the relationship that it has to my depth value, it's specific for those colors and for the value of those colors. The minute you change those colors, then you're going to have to adjust the depth to suit your needs and to ultimately suit your tastes, so that you get the look that you're ultimately after. So with regards to the finalizing of the look of your gemstone, whether you're choosing to follow strictly to what I've done and trying to replicate that, or whether you decide to go your own route, I think that from this point on, it's a good opportunity to now spend some time in just giving it the amount of effort that it needs in order to get it to the point in which you want it to be. And again, going back to what I was saying in the beginning, have a very clear idea of the kind of quality and the direction that you want to go, because then when you get to this phase of the project, you have a much clearer idea as to what your next step should be. That being said, though, I'm pretty sure that maybe one of the things that people are sort of looking at and that they really maybe want to get to in this tutorial would be, well, how do you create something like this? Unfortunately, this is not going to be the tutorial to try and cover the creation of this rock with these crystals. Although I will just say that it's not too complicated, and the shading that is used on the crystals is actually 80% of it is pretty much already what we've created, believe it or not. But there are a few tricks that I have used here, which I would like to show you, and that I think can be really, really useful. And one of them would be, how do you control the gradients? Now, what I mean by that is that if you look at this part of the crystal over here, you can see how it clearly, how it's not as saturated in the color. And how it gets more saturated towards the tip, as well as there being various sort of areas around this this crystal clump where the color changes. Now, the color changes itself, I will just say that's actually pretty easy to do. That's just the simple noise that gets run over the crystals as a whole, whether it be a Perlin noise or any kind of noise that you actually have at your disposal. It's actually literally as easy as that. But with regards to controlling the gradient running up the crystal, that's where it can maybe just be a little bit more, I would say, tricky to try and achieve that. So there's two ways that I know of that it can be done, and I'll show you both ways. The first one is actually using the utility pass inside of Arnold. Now, again, because this is Arnold, it's you can find it on the utility node itself. Other renderers, I'm just not really sure, to be honest with you. But on the utility, there is something under the color mode called P, and that stands for position. Now, for anybody that might be a little bit unfamiliar as to what position is simply color information at render time that stores the actual position data of the pixels itself, or should I rather say the vertices. I think would be a more correct way of saying that, but if I am wrong, please feel free to correct me. But therefore, it stands to reason that if that is the case, and if it is using a simple RGB system in which to actually store these coordinates, if we actually broke each one of those channels down, we'd essentially be able to leverage position information in each one of those channels. So RGB, red, green, and blue. If we swap that out for the simple XYZ, would stand to reason that the red channel would then therefore store all information of the x-axis, the green channel being all the information of the y-axis, and the blue channel being all the information of the z-axis. And if any of you are into compositing, you'll know exactly just how useful this position pass is, and all the kind of powerful things that can be done using that inside a Nuke or your chosen compositing package. So this is this position pass from the utility node that I have, and at the moment, or at least for this render, I just had the RGB that was being piped into the base color. But then what I therefore did was, once again, like I said, RGB, X, Y, and Z, I am looking for something that is going up the crystal. I'm therefore going to take the green channel and plug it in to the base color, and you can see that it gives this result. And that's great, because that's actually the gradient that we're after. That's a nice black to white gradient that can therefore be leveraged, and I can then go along and I can use this as a mask to then control, for instance, something like a color correct node, and that color correct node can have an option for saturation, which can then help to pull off this effect that you're getting over here. So that's just one of the ways. The other way that it can be done is using a state vector, and I'm going to show you that in just a second. Okay, so the other way that we can actually control, or rather create these gradients, is using a state vector. And a state vector works on what is a fairly similar system to the utility pass that I showed in the previous example of how to achieve this. In this case, instead of it having an RGB, as what the position pass has, the state vector actually does have an XYZ that you can directly leverage. So because we're wanting a gradient that runs from the bottom to the top of the crystal, because once again, coming back to this example over here, the one thing that we can do is we can say, if we're going to be using a state vector in this sort of context, we're going to need a float to RGBA. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take all the information from the Y channel, and I'm just going to run it into each one of the channels of the float to RGBA, and then from this one, let me just create a little bit more space over here. I'm going to take the RGBA and I am just going to plug it into the base color, and then just to make things a little bit easier to see, I already have an AOV that has been set up, so I'm just going to plug that into the first slot, and we should see that yeah, we get this result over here. Now this is going to be pure white, and that's because of the fact that the state vector, the variable that it uses by default, is the ray origin, and that's not really going to be useful in this particular example. What we would want to change it to rather is the shading point in object space, and the moment we do that, we should see that this starts to update, and we get a nice sort of gradient that runs from the bottom all the way to the top. It might not be as might not have as much contrast as what you need, and this can easily be changed if we drop down a range node. And then just connect the range node. There we go. And this range node is going to allow us now to obviously alter the actual values of each one of these points. So it would be worthwhile just noting that if you are going to be using this in a practical way, you definitely want to have a handle on the size of your object, because you can go ahead and you can guess some of these numbers, and you will eventually, I suppose, stumble upon what these values need to be, but you would just be much better off with just actually knowing what the size of your object is, so that you can be a lot more specific with regards to what sort of values you want to punch in. But using the range node, we can then control how this gradient falls across the crystal, and or the gemstone rather, and gives us the kind of contrast that we might need, so that we can use it as an effective mask for controlling color saturation. Alright, well that brings us to the end for this tutorial. I just want to say thank you very much for giving your time. I sincerely hope that this has been helpful for you, and I hope that the asset in which I provided is going to be useful in terms of creating your own cool mineral look. If you would like to get in contact with me, you're welcome to do so. I would definitely suggest that you either use my ArtStation or my Behance, or even my email address. Those details are in the description below. Other than that, if you have any further suggestions for things that you might find would be helpful for me to provide, I would definitely encourage you to get in contact with me and let me know. I'd really like to be able to help those who might need the assistance. Other than that, you guys take care, and I'll see you next time.